No, okay, welcome back everyone to this morning's next panel of this Gate Theatre Research Network conference. And it's my pleasure to chair this next panel with three wonderful speakers. Barry Houlihan is my own name of NUI Galway, and it's a pleasure to introduce Shane O'Neill, Dr. Kasia Lech, and Dr. Siobhan Gorman as part of this next panel that will look at some questions around national identities, scenography and design, multilingual theatre in Europe, Beckett and adaptation, and again, how all these questions may come back and intersect at the Gate Theatre. I will introduce all our three speakers individually. Two have very kindly provided pre-recorded presentations, and thank you to our tech colleague here, Dr. Sarah Hoover. I will draw on Sarah's expertise to put those presentations into order very shortly. So we can save maybe the Q&A for the end of the panel, where all three speakers, who are thankfully are here live to join us for a Q&A at the very end, and we can use the chat function to do the Q&A. So perhaps without further ado, I'll move to our first speaker, Shane O'Neill, and his paper title is Joe is Not Theatre, Adapting Television for the Stage at the Beckett Centenary Festival in 2006. Shane O'Neill is a Government of Ireland Irish Research Council funded doctoral candidate at Mary Immaculate College at the University of Limerick. His PhD project is entitled Analysing Samuel Beckett's Self-Translation Process Through His Dramatic Works. Shane has book chapters forthcoming in The Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights, 1716 to 2016, a 2-volume work which is forthcoming with Liverpool University Press. And another chapter forthcoming from Shane is in Samuel Beckett and Translation. Shane's creative writing has been broadcast on RT Radio 1, and his play Kebabs and Hookers was produced in Smock Alley as part of the Scene Plus Heard Festival in 2020. And Shane is also the editor of Longitudinous, an arts and literature magazine.
Hello, my name is Shane O'Neill, and the title of my paper is Joe is Not Theatre, Adapting Television for the Stage at the Beckett Centenary Festival 2006. So Samuel Beckett began writing Joe, a television play, on the 13th of April 1965, his 59th birthday, and finished writing it just 2 weeks later on the 1st of May. Its genesis is resonant of Pratt's last tape, which began life as the McGee monologue for the voice of Patrick McGee. Joe, too, was written with a specific actor in mind, Jack McGowan, although in this case it was not McGowan's voice that Beckett had in mind when writing the text, but his face and facial expressions. Joe himself does not speak throughout the play's duration. James Knowson writes that Beckett had taken McGowan's doleful, haunted eyes and expressive face as inspiration for Joe's character, a guilty figure who it seems is haunted by the accusing voice of conscience, a Jungian anima or inner self. This version of the television play with McGowan in the role of Joe would eventually be broadcast on BBC Two TV on 4th of July 1966, directed by Alan Gibson, with Sean Phillips playing voice. As well as being Beckett's first play written specifically for the medium of television, Joe, or more specifically, the German translation of the play, Joe, is also the first play for which Beckett was assigned a directorial credit. He assisted in the Stuttgart production of Joe in April 1966, which was broadcast on Süddeutscher Rundfunk SDR. Beckett's first-hand experience directing the television play in Stuttgart would eventually lead to his rethinking the play in later years, particularly after his second attempt at directing Joe for SDR 11 years later in 1977. He would share these directorial insights with David Warlow and Rick Clushy, having eventually granted them both permission to stage theatrical performances of Joe. What will become clear, however, is that even during late stages of his career, Beckett had not been able to devise a truly effective way of staging such a performance, and that it took a director other than Beckett, Atom McGoyan at the Gate Theatre in 2006, to effectively rework this television play into a viable theatrical event in itself. So Joe is Beckett's first foray into writing drama for television, written after his first and only experiment with film, which was made in 1965. Joe is most notable perhaps for the way in which it plays with form and technology, and yet the play is almost unusually simplistic for Beckett. One camera follows Joe, our silent, eponymous protagonist, around a small room. From the outset, Joe appears a furtive figure. In accordance to Beckett's characteristically precise directions, Joe spends the opening moments of the play looking out the window of his room, looking in his cupboard, and looking under his bed for some unknown entity. Just as it seems certain that he is alone in the room, the camera begins to focus and hone in slowly on his face, and an accusatory female voice begins to speak. Beckett specifies that the camera movement stops when the voice is speaking. Then it resumes its approach towards Joe's face during the silences. Joe does not speak throughout the play, and his face remains impassive. Neither does he blink while the woman speaks. What becomes clear is that Joe is listening intently to the voice, actively trying to throttle it through means of what she describes as mental thugging. After being witness to Joe's clandestine movements throughout the opening of the play, our initial suspicions about Joe are confirmed as the woman's haunting voice recounts some of his nefarious deeds. As the drama reaches its denouement, it is revealed to the spectator that Joe's mistreatment of a past lover has driven her to suicide. His face, which has been almost inscrutable throughout apart from the evident anguish of performing mental thugging, breaks into a large, terrifying smile of relief as he finally strangles the voice, allowing him to rest for the night. The smile is a late addition to the text made by Beckett, which does not make it into the published version of the text. In April 1966, Beckett emphasized this smile's importance to Alan Schneider, who at the time was directing the American version of Joe. This is a quote from Beckett. "I asked in London and Stuttgart for a smile at the end. Oh, not a real smile. He wins again. So ignore direction, image fades, voices before. Face still fully present till last Joe. Then smile and slow fade." So this smile confirms that Joe has succeeded in quashing the voice in his head. In August 1957, Beckett wrote an oft-quoted letter to Barney Rossett about his radio play All That Fall, in which he claims, "I am absolutely opposed to any form of adaptation with a view to its conversion to theatre." Throughout his life, Beckett often gave this impression of being opposed to the idea of mixing media. However, despite these claims, he quite frequently broke his own rule. Perhaps this is the reason for many theatre practitioners' grievances with the Beckett estate, who have proven themselves much more rigid about these rules than Beckett himself ever was throughout his lifetime. There are numerous examples of Beckett mixing media, the most ostentatious of these being his adaptation of a self-translation of Krapp's Last Tape into a chamber opera for the composer Marcel Mihalovici, entitled Krapp ou la dernière bande. No recording of this opera performance survives, but from all accounts it was not very successful. From Joe's inception, many efforts had been made to bring it to the stage. Most of these attempts, it would appear, were not very effectively or imaginatively conceived. Indeed, for much of his life, Beckett was adamant that Joe was not to be performed on any medium other than television. As early as 20th of November 1969, Beckett wrote to Jérôme Landon that there was "pas question de Dijon au théâtre," Dijon, of course, being the title of Beckett's self-translation of the television play. This letter quite obviously echoes the sentiment of his 1957 letter to Rossett. Even as his career progressed, he continued to see Joe as a play for television and no other media. This is most emphatically expressed in his letter to Sue Freely at Spokesmen, who were his British agents in London, which was sent in the summer of 1979. This letter was written in response to Enzo Mauri's request at Radio Televisione Italiana for permission to produce Joe with the recorded voice of the actor rather than the female recorded voice called for by the stage directions. This is the shortest letter in the 4 collected volumes and certainly the most blunt, consisting simply of just one word in response to his request: no. As is often the case with Beckett, there were exceptions to this rule, particularly when it came to requests from his close personal friends or respected artists. S.E. Gontarski notes that actors began testing stage versions of the teleplay at the Studio Theatre of Paris, a bilingual actors' studio-style workshop, and the group, with Gordon Heath and Helen Gary Bishop, staged it formally, with Beckett's consent, at New York University's Samuel Beckett Festival in the autumn of 1978. It's important to note here that this is after a second experience directing the play at SDR in 1977. So then this was reprised again in New York in 1981, again with Beckett's permission, but as Bishop recalls, with Beckett's admonition. This is a quote from Beckett. "Yes, I guess it could work, but it's not a habit I want to encourage." So despite Beckett's lack of encouragement, this production was once again reprised in the spring of 1986 for the Festival d'automne Beckett dans le siècle, colloque international pour le 80e anniversaire de Samuel Beckett, this time under the direction of Alan Schneider, with David Warrilow as Joe and Helen Gary Bishop again as voice. Warrilow, of course, would later perform Cette Fois, Beckett's self-translation of that time, and Solo, his self-translation of A Piece of Monologue, at the 1991 Beckett Festival at the Gate Theatre. Thus, it seems that when David Warrilow expressed interest in acting in and directing a television production of Edjo with Helen Gary Bishop, that was the moment when Beckett seriously began considering a stage adaptation of the text. He writes to Warrilow, "In an eventual stage presentation, not to be encouraged, light may be used in an attempt to suggest progression towards final close-up, i.e., gradually brought up on the actor, finally on the face alone, while on all else correspondingly down." From the outset, Beckett's concept for a theatrical production of Edjo seems inspired by the play on lights and spotlights in his own play. The narrowing of the light until only the face of the actor is illuminated would expose Joe's guilty conscience for his misdeeds and make the final smile more dramatic and frightening. After Warrilow's efforts to transform Edjo into theatre, Beckett gave Rick Clucci permission to direct and star in a production as part of the Beckett Project in Chicago in 1983 and 1984. Clucci, a close friend of Beckett's and the founder of the San Quentin Drama Workshop, would go on to make this production a mainstay in his troupe's repertoire. On Christmas Day 1985, Beckett wrote to Rick Clucci, stating explicitly in his letter that Edjo is not theatre. If I allow it there now in Chicago, it is solely on your account and because of you. A statement which seems a little contradictory, considering the various stage productions for which Beckett had already given permission. Years earlier, in May 1979, Beckett had written to Clucci that the piece seems to me in need of serious rethinking. This was immediately after Beckett's second experience of working on Edjo with SDR at Stuttgart. Clucci wanted to work on the play for television with Billy Whitelaw playing the voice of the accusing woman and with Jocelyn Herbert for the BBC. This remake never materialized, however, and as a result, Beckett gave Clucci permission to stage Edjo at the Goodman Theatre in Chicago. Beckett's letter to Clucci contained additional staging notes for an eventual theatrical production, although it is clear that Beckett himself has not yet found a solution for a theatrical adaptation of this text. These notes can be considered, to use a phrase coined by Dirk van Hule, as part of the play's epigenesis, the continuation of the play's genesis after publication. Unlike Egoyan, Beckett does not consider using a camera, which in hindsight seems like the more simple solution. Instead, Beckett still believes that the most effective way of staging the play would be to focus the light on the actor's face, in silence, following each onset of voice, reduce till finally on face alone, seat of this evil. So this brings us to Edjo at the Gate. More than 20 years after Beckett's letter to Clucci, Canadian film director Atom Egoyan directed Edjo at the Gate Theatre in 2006 for the Beckett Centenary Festival, which marked the playwright's 100th birthday. Joe was played by Michael Gambon, and Penelope Wilton performed the role of voice. Egoyan's production, writes Stanley Gontarski, effectively added a new work to the Beckettian theatrical canon. This is indeed high praise from such an esteemed scholar of Beckett's dramatic work. Egoyan's solution to focusing the attention on Joe's face was far more modern than those previously considered by Beckett, which was just mostly focusing the light on the actor's face. Indeed, Karen Fricker, writing for The Guardian, believed that by mixing the media, Egoyan had found a simple and brilliant solution to what seemed like an impossible theatrical challenge. This is a quote from Fricker. A live camera just off stage is trained on Michael Gambon's face, and the image is projected onto a scrim in front of the playing area. This not only delivers the text, but adds fresh nuances. The motionlessness of Gambon's body contrasts ironically and pathetically with the emotions of defiance, boredom, regret, fatigue, anger, playing across that amazing, expressive, baggy face. Fricker's only concern with the production is that the overall intensity of the piece, which makes her feel as if she is living inside someone else's filthy conscience, is slightly marred by the over-amplification of Penelope Wilton's voice, which draws undue attention to the technology involved. In this way, the production resembles more closely a cinematic event than a televisual one, as those watching television will normally have more control over the volume of what they are watching. Although the pre-recording of Wilton's voice gives it a mechanical, automated tone, this also preserves an important element of the production that Beckett himself directed. When describing her time working on the 1966 production of the play for the BBC, Sean Phillips recounts that Beckett wanted to achieve a colourlessness in tone, and so a microphone was placed right up against her lips, and as her voice was being recorded, both high and low frequencies were filtered out. Indeed, there is something intentionally hypnotic and robotic about Phillips' performance, which is available on YouTube, so this is likely an element that Beckett or that Egoyan was determined to recreate or preserve. In his review of the play, Gontarski claims that Egoyan's conception, with its hybrid technology of stagecraft, television and film, allowed for the seamless translation of the television work to the stage. So this is a quote from Gontarski. Camera movement was imperceptible, but at some point audience members realized that they were suddenly watching a more intense close-up of Joe, or almost inside his head. What was full-body Joe on his bed, face and 3/4 profile, had become just face. With the close-up, all was poised for that perfect ending, a smile, through which, as Beckett tells us extra-textually in his productions and in his letters to Schneider, Joe has done it again, succeeded in stopping the assaulting voice, yet again. Egoyan's production, as did all other adaptations of the teleplay, ends with the agony of the assault, voice with plenty of venom, face just listening hard and brain agonizing. So in Gambon, it seems, Egoyan had also chosen the perfect actor for the role of Joe. By the end of the performance, tears of anguish streamed from his face, ensuring that his closing smile after the description of his past lover's suicide was both triumphant and terrifying. The success of Egoyan's production at the Gate meant that it was subsequently brought to London, then Sydney in 2007, where Charles Dance played Joe, and later again to New York in 2008, where the role of Joe was taken on by Liam Neeson. In conclusion, it seems noteworthy that Joe was again brought to the stage in 2020, just before the beginning of the pandemic. It was performed in Jermyn Street, London. Trevor Nunn directed Lisa Dwan in the role of Woman of Voice, and Niall Buggy played the role of Joe. This version seems to have been directly inspired by the 2006 Gate Theatre production. A camera moves closer and closer to Joe's face, closely capturing his expressions. However, reviews of this production were much more critical than those of the Gate performance. Arifa Akbar writes that, even if this visual device aims for faithfulness to Beckett's directions, it seems like a too literal TV-to-stage transposition. Joe's moving close-up on screen is a distraction that simultaneously renders Buggy's theatrical performance too static. What seems clear from Egoyan's experiment at the Gate, something that was indeed clear to Beckett himself as his own oeuvre attests, is that theatre must constantly be rethought and re-envisaged if it is to stay current and relevant. Beckett himself was never satisfied with his own emendations to the theatrical version of the play, but he most likely would have improved of Egoyan's solution to the staging problem, which remained very close to Beckett's original vision while updated for the 21st century. Despite his own misgivings of mixing media, throughout his life Beckett would nonetheless allow various attempts at innovating his pieces as long as they did not overly disrupt their artistic intent. Indeed, more concessions such as these will need to be made by the estate if they want Beckett productions to continue to thrive in this technological era. Thank you.
Great, and thanks so much, Shane, for that. Expertly pre-recorded as well, I must say. And again, a really fascinating insight there into the production histories of A.Joe and bringing it right up to the contemporary gay theatre production. So again, thanks so much to Shane for that. So just moving on to our second paper in this panel, and just to reiterate as well that all our speakers who have pre-recorded, and indeed the 3 speakers will all be available for Q&A at the end. So our next speaker I'm delighted to introduce is Dr. Kasia Lech, who is going to give our paper entitled Challenging Anxieties of Intelligibility, Dramaturgical Practices in Contemporary Multilingual Theatre in Europe. Kasia has a PhD from University College Dublin, is a scholar, actor, storyteller, puppeteer, and senior lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University. Her research and creative practice explores theatre through practice-based and traditional scholarship and primarily focuses on verse, multilingualism, and transnational experience. Kasia's monograph, Dramaturgia Form, examines verse in 21st century theatre practice across different languages, cultures, and media. And Kasia is currently working on her next book, Multilingual Dramaturgies Towards New European Theatre, which is forthcoming with Palgrave Macmillan. Kasia is trained at the Polish National Academy of Theatre Arts and performed internationally, including starring at the Grey Cat, starring as the Grey Cat, a puppet that co-hosted the award live TV show for children, Cyber Mwiz, and I know I'm not saying that right, apologies, on Polish National Television. Kasia has co-founded Polish Theatre Ireland, an intercultural theatre company based in Dublin, and is an executive director and editor-in-chief at theatretimes.com. And Kasia is a co-convener of the Translation Adaptation Dramaturgy Working Group at IFTR. So if I may call on my colleague again on tech here, Dr. Sarah Hoover, who might be able to bring Kasia's presentation next on stream. Thank you.
This paper surveys how selected dramaturgical practices in contemporary multilingual theatre in Europe attend to the issue of intelligibility. In particular, I focus on works that strive to create a sense of playfulness with language and, arising from it, freedom to encounter multilingualism without translation, thus challenging anxieties of intelligibility. Through that, the works discussed surge to engage with hierarchical structures, migration, exile, and exclusion, working towards more democratic and inclusive modes of intelligibility and interactions. The paper is based on performance analysis and qualitative interviews with international theatre makers working in Europe. My aim, grown out of the eternal tension between what I want to say and the temporal word limits, is to give an evocative sample of practices, signaling certain possibilities and prompting questions and discussions afterwards. The question of how practitioners make their multilingual productions clear for spectators keeps returning in scholarship and practice of multilingual theatre. These are underlined by contemporary Western anxieties of intelligibility, helped by technological developments like surtitles, translating glasses, and by anxieties of intelligibility, I mean the need to understand every word and to fix meanings in order to communicate, that Eva Karpiński and Stephen Kutzer reflect on. But they also grow out of financial contexts and, to quote Karpiński, the paradoxical effect of neoliberal transformations on linguistic diversity with the hegemony of English on the one hand, and the revival of ethno-linguistic particularity on the other. This point has several layers in relation to multilingual theatre. Here I want to signal one aspect, the question of whose intelligibility matters the most, which is underlined by economic, historic, and social contexts. Several practitioners I interviewed referred to special adjustments in their shows needed to be done for London audience, and the paradox arising from London's multilingualism makes my point stronger, so London audience can engage with the shows. Lan Laurers from Belgium Neat Company wanted actor Grace Ellen Barkey to add more English in her monologue, opening monologue for London's South Bank performances of The Blind Poet. and multilingual opera The Passenger, directed by David Poultney and telling Holocaust stories, was performed entirely in English, were performed in London in English National Opera. These two large, expensive productions were performed in big venues with big economic pressures. A very different examples of hierarchies of intelligibility and the tension that Karpinski refers to comes from Ireland. In 2015, I got into a public discussion on Facebook with the Abbey Theatre casting director. The cast of Shibboleth by Stacey Gregg was announced, and the role of Polish character Agnieszka went to an Irish actor. No Dublin-based Polish actor was invited to audition. Casting director explained that it was important for the character to have an authentic Belfast accent, as Agnieszka was raised in Northern Ireland. I asked whether the character spoke Polish in the play. Yes, she said. In fact, there was a full scene between father and daughter in Polish. Does the actor you casted speak Polish? No, but she will try her best, responded casting director. While I won't be discussing this further, I want to signal it because the artists I selected for this paper try to problematize the questions of whose intelligibility matters the most. And they do it by playing with subtitles, by playing with translation, and playing with form. Jan Lauwers, Belgian director making multilingual theatre for the last 3 decades, states, "The invention of subtitles and theatre is somehow a failure of multilingual theatre. Before they didn't exist, so we were forced to invent the theatre that was multilingual. The subtitles, the multilingual theatre stopped. It doesn't exist anymore." Niklas Torensson from Swedish Theatre Forad says that for him subtitles take the focus away from immediacy of theatre. He explains the decision to stop using them in reference to one of their performances. It felt like people were sitting and reading a novel while the actor was giving them a rock concert. The intermediate aspects of subtitles and how they raise questions of orality and literacy in the performance have been discussed before. Marvin Carson's theatrical playfulness comes to mind. He explains how subtitles can raise some post-dramatic issues. And in particular, he also refers to how they can create heteroglossia by functioning as a dialogic tool, facilitating multiple meanings and contradictions that the productions create. For the example, I want to focus on Fitz Carson's broader description, and in particular, it speaks to Mihail Bakhtin's definition of heteroglossia as a double-voice discourse that can facilitate multiple contradictions that deprivilege and reinvigorate language, increasing its self-consciousness in relation to an individual, as well as to broader political, social, and cultural contexts. The example comes from 2016, Nie mów nikomu, Don't Tell Anyone, directed and dramaturged by Adam Ziajski. Ziajski is a Polish established theatre maker with background in independent theatre and happenings. He's the director of and founder of Scena Robocza, working stage in Poznań, which aims to be a repertoire theatre for independent companies and artists creating on the peripheries of cultural landscape defined by Polish mainstream theatres. Nie mów nikomu is built on stories of deaf people in Poland. It is performed by deaf actors in Polish Sign Language, Lorma, the language of people who are deaf and blind, and in written Polish and English live typed by Dominika Mroczek-Dąbrowska, as a translation of what the actors sign. The translations are projected on the back wall. If the production is performed for international audiences, English subtitles appeared after Polish subtitles, and they are interpreted live from Polish subtitles. So the prolonging of the translation process is further emphasized by the rapid pace of sign language, which is much quicker than Polish speech and Polish and English typing. Finally and crucially, Mroczek-Dąbrowska types Polish words following syntax of Polish Sign Language, so it looks and in our heads sounds strange, and making errors from typos to grammar mistakes, depending on the show. All this is accompanied by a cacophony of sounds unbearable for a hearing audience that needs to use headphones in order to handle the noise, highlighting it is the hearing audience that needs accessibility tools. The glitching of translation and experience of language, following Rosa Mankman's theory of glitches, connects this piece to the aesthetic of failure, and I'm using here this Ong's idea of language as technology. Łukasz Mirocha explains that glitches reveal the presence of software and its manipulation of the digital product, and by doing so, its weaknesses. The weighting, the noise, and the errors in Zajski's surtartes are a malfunction element, but also a reveal of what Menkman would describe as commodification processes, how the hegemony of one language, its hegemonic coding, impact upon other languages and experience thereof. The glitch is emphasized by the reverse hierarchy of languages in comparison with Polish reality. By doing so, Zajski emphasizes, to use Karpiński again, unequal vectors of cultural economic exchange that operate in any language transactions, but in particular in exchange between Polish and Polish Sign Language, which is still not recognized as an official language in Poland. And the stories that Zajski's actors tell from the stage reveal the impact this has on the economic and social reality of the characters. And I am very conscious of the link here to Ireland and the relatively recent legal recognition of ISL as a minority language, directly preceded by Amanda Coogan's and Dublin Theatre of Deaf, Talk Real Fine, devised from Teresa Divi's work. The next way in which the artists explore intelligibility is by playing with live, non-translation and translation and interpreting. Niklas Torensson, a Swedish theatre maker and founder of the Theater Forat in Malmö, which was created in response to changing population of Malmö in Sweden and Europe. Torensson wanted to make theatre for people who lived in Malmö, and the city's 45% of residents were either born abroad or have two parents born abroad, and the Arabic countries are dominating foreign nationalities. Forat, when you say it in Swedish, is forat, it means because, so theatre because. But in Arabic, the river, which I know in Polish as Eufrat, and which in English is pronounced as Euphrates, sounds like forat. Theatre Forat searched for a global perspective on social issues and challenged prejudices, white patriarchy, and division between languages and cultures. The company produced 32 multilingual theatres works, and it existed until December 2016, when its activity has been suspended. Torensson in the interview explains how at the start the company was focused on intelligibility and translation, worrying about Swedish audience not understanding Arabic and looking for a performative way to translate. It was always collaborative, as no one was good enough in Arabic and Swedish, and there wasn't enough funding for a translation. The collaborative and democratic nature of their translation stretched to the audience, as in some shows they asked Arabic spectators to translate for Swedish audience. They were whispering to each other, but it was only when they accepted that their focus on intelligibility and monolingual audience took too much focus from the theater and actually confused multilingual, they were able to build on the fact that they often did not share one language in rehearsals and on miscommunications and misunderstandings that arose from it. This in turn led to them, to use Karpiński again, embracing non-translation as the absolute staging of multilingual hospitality. An example of that is a scene from 2016 Smash Up that criticizes Swedish help thinking. In Toresson's words, "We have the perfect democracy and we should help these people, and especially that we know better." End quote. In the scene, Siham Shurafa, a Swedish actress with Egyptian and Palestinian background, played a Swedish woman inviting a migrant, Egyptian artist Rami Assam, to her house as the act of her goodwill, openness, and willingness to help those that need her help and her democracy. The scene interrogated her attitudes through multilingual dramaturgy built on both the actor's competencies and lack thereof. The scene was partly improvised. Assam spoke English to Shurafa and Arabic to himself, commenting on her attitude. She spoke English and Swedish to him, but her character's English was not very good, and she expressed the assumption that he should learn Swedish to integrate into society. And sociolinguistic Alistair Panicook is smiling as I say that. Her vocabulary was built on goodwill phrases that Shurafa experienced in her life in Sweden. Assam did not speak Swedish and did not understand it. His comments were also based on his assumptions of what has been said. This, recalls Torensson, led to a scene highlighting in every review and evoking the most laughter from the audience, revealing following Eric Waite's arguments that audiences recognition of the reality presented and the interrogatory power of the scene. So far, I focused on works in which a male director was also representative of the dominating cultures and languages and companies, while independent received regular funding. This was something that Gziajski and Turenson were very aware of during their creative process, and this is something we can speak about after the paper. The next example was created in a precarious context of a very low-funded transnational independent theatre company and rehearsed in Spain and the UK, courtesy of Ryanair. This show Rosaura, was an inaugural production of Teatro Inverso formed by UK-based Spanish Paula Rodriguez and Spain-based Spanish Sandra Arpa to find new ways of staging Spanish Golden Age texts, especially ones in verse. First created a Spanish production in 2015, Rosaura was translated for the British stage in 2016 and performed in London in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, which divided the country through a debate about who should or should not be in the UK. Both Spanish and English versions of Rosaura are bilingual, but the Spanish-English proportions differ depending on whether the show is performed in Spain, Mexico, USA, or the UK. My focus is the English version, so the London version. Arpa and Rodriguez devised it as a mixture of Calderon's verse in Spanish with minimal addition of prose in Spanish written by the actors, English verse translation of one short excerpt at the very end of the play, and English prose also written by the actors. In the performance, Arpa and Rodriguez use heightened physical gestures and movements to perform Calderon's verse in Spanish, and they address the audience directly to storytell the plot in English, but not translate everything that happens. For example, Arpa describes Rosaura seeing Segismundo's tower for the first time, which is followed by the Spanish source lines from that meeting. The changes between the language are emphasized by the change of language mode and the performance styles, heightening issues of language performativity and identity. This in turn is a reminder that Arpa and Rodriguez are in constant process of negotiating in between their roles. They perform multiple persona from Calderon's play and contemporary culture, including Oprah Winfrey and Boris Johnson, and on the top of that, they tell the story of Rosaura negotiating her own identities. The non-translated verse in Spanish references Calderon, as does the physical copy of the play on the stage, and his cultural context, reminding the spectators that Arpa and Rodriguez also negotiate between several cultural contexts, and in each of these they occupy a different position: foreigner, migrant, native, guide, guest, host, actor, storyteller, dramaturg, and translator. As hosts, they continuously check with the audience to ensure that they feel welcome, but not patronized. Paula, they got it, says Arpa, when Rodriguez engages in a lengthy explanation. By engaging with non-translation, they paradoxically perform what Lyra describes as reciprocal hospitality, thus welcoming the audience as their hosts and at the same time becoming their guests. Their cultural negotiation is created with spectators in mind, but also invites the audience to reciprocate simply by listening. That hospitality speaks particularly powerful to the sociopolitical context in the 2016 Brexit UK with Theresa May's hostile environment. Rosaura is a bridge to the final section of this paper, which looks at how formal structures can also challenge anxieties of intelligibility. Some clear evidence comes from opera that, as argued by Marta Matteo, in Europe often takes multi-European cultural identity rather than belonging to one particular nation and has multilingualism deeply rooted in its tradition. A very interesting case study is The Passenger, what I already mentioned. It's 2010 staging of an opera about Auschwitz and the memory of Auschwitz, directed by David Mouty, based on Auschwitz survivor Zofia Posmy's novel, based then on Posmy's radio play, with a libretto by Alexander Medvedev and music by Mieczysław Weinberg. The Passenger, accompanied by subtitles and performed as monolingual in London, gives in to the pressure of relationship between intelligibility and economic success, so I won't be discussing it here. However, I am referring to it here because Poutny reflects that in opera, multilingualism is facilitated by the fact that, quote, the nuance of language in opera is very different to what it is in the theater, because the music carries so much of the nuance. So somehow the aesthetic dimension of the experience releases at least some of the anxieties of intelligibility. And that brings to mind Peter Brook, when discussing his production of Orgast by Ted Hughes, a play in verse structuring an invented language, he suggested that the musical effect of verse can lure spectators' need to understand words when encountering a foreign language. And my choice of lure here is not coincidental. I'm paraphrasing W.B. Yeats, because Hughes' Orgast echoes Yeats' attempt to create new dramatic sound through verse. A more contemporary application of this is Jemaja, Królowa Mórz, Jemaja, the Queen of the Seas, written by Małgorzata Sikorska-Miszczuk and directed in 2016 by Martyna Majewska for the Wrocław Puppetry Theatre. Jemaja tells the story of a 5-year-old boy, Omar, who lives with his father. One day, Omar wakes up to find his city taken by war. Omar and his father must escape on a boat. The play was written in response of the death of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned in the Mediterranean Sea in September 2015, and whose image was imprinted on the global conscious. Verse appears not only once in this production, but it is crucial in Kering's play strategies to facilitate cross-national and cross-species empathy as an emotional connection and recognition of one another's responses and readiness to constant and open-ended engagement. Hugo, the dinosaur molecule, played by Stanisław Przepiórka, as evident on this picture here, delivers the following lines as his introduction. Bo mnie tu nie ma już bardzo długo, jestem Hugo. Śpiewające molekuły ułożyły się z powrotem w kształt ponury mej postury. Wypijaj herbatę z całej siły, a poczujesz moje moce. Prehistoryczne noce przyśnią ci się już niedługo, jestem Hugo. Spijaj herbatę w wielkim skupieniu, a nauczysz się grać na grzebieniu. The text prioritizes rhyming structures marked by italics and letters and colors, marked by colors at the end of the respective lines, over the actual sense of the words, so it makes as little sense in Polish as it does in English. In addition, Przepiórka delivers it as if rapping, using the heightened rhythm and rhyme to introduce a new linguistic form and aesthetics that require that the audience listen to the sound and rhythm rather than being concerned with the sense of words. After his verse utterance, Przepiórka begins communicating in a made-up language in which he teaches spectator to pronounce Omar's name. In other words, through double foreignization, he makes Omar's foreignness familiar, but it's the initial appearance of verse that prepares the spectators for it. It also challenges the idea of language as unique to humans, which links with Queen Jemaja, played by Marta Kwiek, often communicating through vocalizations that remind one of Delphine's language. I haven't left myself much space for conclusion. The paper articulated some tensions between communication, multilingualism, and intelligibility, underlined by historic, social, and economic pressures, and provided some examples of how practitioners tackle them. From my practitioner experience, this is not easy, and bowing to economic context is something unavoidable. So the question we must be asking is how the support can be provided from those in power, funding bodies, large and well-supporting venues to create transnational spaces for those experimentations. So, as idealistic as it sounds, we can unleash the radical potential of multilingual dramaturgies to both facilitate and interrogate multifaceted, multifocal, and pluralistic culture that reflects the diversity of identities, symbols, and cultures in contemporary Europe. Thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thanks so much, Kasia, for a really, really wide-ranging and detailed paper, and so much there again to think about. So again, thanks so much for that, and indeed for another excellently pre-recorded and clear presentation as well. So that brings us on to the final speaker as part of this morning's panel. So it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Dr. Siobhan Gorman. And Siobhan's paper is entitled National Identities in and European Scenographies. And Siobhan is a senior lecturer and postgraduate teaching lead for the College of Arts at the University of Lincoln. Siobhan's monograph, Theatre, Performance and Design, Scenographies in a Modernising Ireland, is forthcoming with Palgrave Macmillan. In 2015, Siobhan edited with Dr. Charlotte McIver of here in NUI Galway, the first book to focus on devised performance within Irish contexts, and Siobhan's work has been published across a range of peer-reviewed journals, edited collections, and other media. Siobhan is on the editorial board of Studies in Costume and Performance, the executive committee of the Irish Society for Theatre Research, and is an expert member of the Gay Theatre Research Network. Siobhan was part of the curatorial team for Ireland's participation in the Prague Quadrennial in 2015, and Siobhán has also organised several conferences and theatre-focused initiatives, as well as presenting her research at over 30 national and international events. So we have a live presentation this time from Siobhán.
Okay, thanks for having me. Sorry for the brief delay there. Okay, so today I want to think about the relationships between scenography and nation. And I'm going to do that in quite a broad strokes kind of way today, that considers a range of examples from 19th century paratheatrical display to 20th century and contemporary evocations of scenography and nation. So since I'm looking at national identities and European scenographies, I'm going to start by discussing the Prague Quadrennial. Okay, so the PQ then is the world's largest exhibition of performance design or scenography, a term that can broadly be defined as the manipulation and orchestration of the performance environment. It was established in 1967, originally aiming to promote Czech and Slovak stage design and theatre architecture to an international audience. It can be also seen as part of a range of European post-war endeavours that sought to promote intercultural tolerance, but that also came to brand the national in international contexts. And that's something that Patrick Lonergan has discussed, across his work, and most recently in a special issue of the journal Scene on performance and Ireland. Okay, so if we want to move on to the next slide. So I'm interested in how we might conceive of national scenographies. What processes have informed their development in the context of modernisation, and how and to what effect do overlapping practices of theatre performance and design seek to construct national identities or promote national consciousness. This paper touches on contemporary and historical examples of what I see as intersections between scenography in its broadest sense and nation, as in the seminal phrase coined by Benedict Anderson, an imagined community. Anderson, whose work has been widely reappraised since he passed away in 2015, was, as Max Bergholz and others have recently pointed out, the first to theorize in detail a sense of nationness as imagining, restoring, remembering, dreaming. As such, Anderson provided a new conceptual vocabulary to excavate and explain human agency, and specifically the role of the human imagination in the making of nationalism into a real political force, and that's a quote from Bergholz as well. These ideas illuminate the various affective powers of scenography in relation to politics, patriotism, and processes of visual, audiovisual, and material cultural exchange. So it's timely to consider the relationships between scenography and nation at this moment, considering the proliferation in recent years of extreme and often exclusionary forms of nationalism, such as those espoused by Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, and such far-right European parties as Poland's Conservative Law and Justice Party, which took power in 2015, and the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, or the EKRE, which was established in 2012 and in 2019 won 17.8% of the vote. So on to the next slide, please, Sarah. It's also timely considering that the winners of the Golden Triga at the second last PQ in 2015 were Theatre Number 99's 2010 project Unified Estonia. This project might be seen as prescient and in some ways quite problematic in relation to the more recent rise of the EKRE in Estonia, and from a current perspective in which right-wing populism has really proliferated, particularly via social media, where reductive memes, often involving various forms of mis and disinformation, appeal to the public and are rapidly spread amongst users who react emotionally to them. Widely lauded as the largest theatre event in contemporary Europe, Unified Estonia encompassed the members of Theatre Number 99, announcing its largest show to date, then following this by inhabiting the political landscape, playing a fascist, populist, policyless party called Unified Estonia. This involved 44 days of infiltrating news and other media. And you can move on to the next slide, Sarah. Recruiting a youth wing, creating controversy, for example, by erecting and subsequently surreptitiously defacing their own posters, all culminating in a massive party convention with an atmosphere resembling a rock concert. So this event, the final convention, was characterized by a sense of suspense with regard to whether or not this theatre company would actually go into politics, having now achieved 25% support in pre-election polls. At the convention, the entrance of Theatre Number 99's director, Tit Ajasu, playing the party's leader, was preceded by a marching procession bearing large flags alternating between depictions of the party's logo, designed deliberately to evoke the swastika, and the Estonian national flag. Chanting, clapping, and singing nationalist songs appeared to stir up heightened feelings of fellowship in support of this new force that seemed to promise a regenerated nation. Aiming to educate people on citizenship and democracy and to reveal how political populism works on the public, Unified Estonia might retrospectively be seen to have played a role in affectively activating the public appetite for far-right populism, an appetite reflected in real Estonian politics in the subsequent and growing support for the EKRE. So the next slide, please, Sarah. So Unified Estonia did show how scenography can operate within larger cultural and affective economies in the service of constructing a national community and promoting a sense of sticking together. Theatre N099's use of flags, the national flag and those bearing the party's logo, is a case in point. Sarah Ahmed, discussing the widespread display of United States flags in the USA following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, discusses how the fellow feeling, as she calls it, associated with nationalism involves, and this is a quote, a turning towards the repetition or reiteration of signs of fellowship, such as flags. And I have another quote here. The flag as a sign that has historically signified territorial conquest, as well as love for the nation or patriotism, has effects. The repetition of the flag sign displays a sense of witness and forness. So Ahmed's views on the affective semiotics of national flags illuminates the communal set of patriotic affects conjured by these and other aspects of the spectacle at the Unified Estonia Convention. Unified Estonia and its acquisition of the PQ's Golden Triga reveal complex entanglements between scenography and nation that merit further consideration, especially since the core of the PQ has, since 1967, presented recent trends in the field largely within national exhibition formats. One scholar who offers some useful theoretical reflections on how the countries and student sections operate is Barbara Brahadova. So if I could have the next slide, Sarah. She argues that at the Prague Quadrennial, the demonstration of the national is created through consensus by designated authorities. The selected artists, performance styles, and scenographic strategies are unified under the single umbrella of the particular country and its scenography. The concept of nationality created at the PQ by the curators embraces Bourdieu's concept of symbolic power. The spectators' expectations are reinforced or questioned by means of the power of the cultural academic field to consecrate. Okay, and we can move on to the next slide. So beyond consideration of the PQ, other scholars have evoked the interrelations of scenography and nation in reference to, for example, the Olympic Games. And we heard yesterday that Joan Fitzpatrick Dean's new book also deals with the 2012 opening ceremony. Back in 2013, Alison Oddie and Christine White in the first edition of the journal Scene, and Christopher Baugh in the second edition of his seminal book, Theatre, Performance and Technology, situated in the context of scenography, The Isles of Wonder, spectacular patriotic celebration of British culture that constituted the London 2012 Olympics opening ceremony. Such events as Olympics opening ceremonies might be situated within the context of expanded scenography. And I can have the next slide, Sarah. As discussed in Jocelyn McKinney and Scott Palmer's important 2017 edited collection, the title Sonography Expanded. In the introduction, McKinney and Palmer usefully point to the potential significance of applying a scenographic lens to a range of work that involves the interaction and indeed interaction of humans and the non-human more than human, framed within the broad category of performance. As such, including new political, social, and cultural concerns in more direct and diverse ways than hitherto, and signalling new aesthetic and ethical approaches to making and viewing artwork. So as the repeated use of the term new here suggests, McKinney and Palmer focus mainly on contemporary practices that, to them, seem to bear little relation to historical forms of scenography, although they acknowledge key shifts in scenography in the 20th century that have precipitated what we now see as expanded scenography. However, I argue that the lens of expanded scenography can also usefully be turned onto history. Using that lens is particularly revelatory when it comes to the interrelations of scenography and nation, allowing us to utilize the new perspectives that expanding the field has generated to reassess the histories of these interrelations, to engage anew with their traces, and to unearth previously unacknowledged genealogies. Next slide, please, Sarah. Great exhibitions of the 19th century, for example, became progressively more infused with displays of human action. The national form of segregation established at the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London persisted across a multitude of late 19th century international exhibitions that followed. The Great Exhibition initially was organised to showcase England's industrial advancement on an international stage and to have a civilising influence on what the empire positioned as less developed countries. As such, these exhibitions operated similarly to the spectacles of 19th century London theatre, which, as Ball points out, and the quote is on the next slide, which, as Ball points out, could evoke a sense of authority, where the stage knows or owns something that the spectator does not. And more subtly, in the knowledge and ownership of technology, there may also dwell the colonial power of the nation, the patriarchal power of the monarch, duke, and state, the power of the theatre and its means of presentation. So next slide, please, Sarah. So from the early 1860s on, reviews of exhibitions indicated a desire for increased attention to the human aspects of each participating nation. Patrons and organisers complied, progressively displaying more indigenous arts, crafts, folk traditions, national costumes and dance through national pavilions, amusements and sideshows, as well as ethnic restaurants and villages. These villages together formed living ethnographic museums. For example, 3,000 people from around the world resided in ethnic villages designed to illustrate the life of other cultures in the Midway Pleasance section of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This included 2 Irish villages in which individuals from rural communities produced and displayed crafts. Writing for a contemporary magazine, John C. Eastman described the Midway Pleasance as brilliant with the colours of all nations and a kaleidoscope of the world that furnishes a passing panorama of life in every zone. Ultimately, as Victorian international exhibitions became increasingly focused on the links between culture and place, so too did their modes of exhibiting increasingly involve scenographic display. And can I have the next slide, Sarah? National costumes also were modelled, likely influencing the trend for dressing in different and often highly inventive versions of national costume at Victorian fancy dress balls, as evidenced in Arden Holt's Fancy Dresses Described or What to Wear at Fancy Balls, a how-to guide that went through 6 editions between 1879 and 1896. The next slide, Sarah. The Irish Industries Association contributed one of 2 Irish villages to Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893 under the patronage of Lady Aberdeen, wife of the at the time newly appointed Viceroy of Ireland and the first Viceroy to support Home Rule. Housed in replicas of Irish cottages, peasants from rural areas worked at cottage industries. The labour, mostly performed by women, was for public display, including weaving, spinning, lace making, and otherwise crafting decorative objects. Aberdeen foregrounded authenticity with what she called lads and lasses plying needle or loom or wheel or carving tools with equal dexterity. And that's a quote that I borrowed from Fintan Cullen's Ireland on Show from 2016. The architecture of Aberdeen's village included a 2/3 size Blarney Castle, the battlements of which were adorned with a number of flags. Amid flags of the USA and the United Kingdom, the highest flag depicted a plain green field with the legend Éireann go Bragh, Ireland forever, a statement of Irish nationalist allegiance frequently seen on Irish American flags of the second half of the 19th century. This unofficial national flag is known as the Maid of Éireann. As the Columbian Exposition drew to a close in October, a group of Irishmen tore down the Union Jack, which had also adorned the castle, although it occupied a less prominent position. So Aberdeen's mobilisation of the Maid of Éireann flag to call Irish people to unite and prove their shared love for the old country had backfired. Ahmed discusses the affective potential of flags in the context of love, that is, patriotism, as love for the nation. However, hateful emotions also can become attached to flags, here to a representation of colonial power over Ireland at a time of growing anti-colonial Irish nationalism. So ethnic villages presented the others of colonised countries as peculiar sources of amusement. But Aberdeen's efforts to authentically present the peasantry might also be seen to have influenced the detailed naturalism on the stage of the Abbey Theatre. And can I have the next slide, Sarah? The establishment of which was key, of course, to Ireland's turn of the century cultural nationalism and post-colonial processes. In addition to having real people from the local areas represented on stage advise on movement and speech and mannerisms, early Abbey practitioners incorporated real objects and clothing and materials garnered from communities in such regions as the west of Ireland. So the next slide, Sarah. The lens of expanded scenography reveals the complexity of interrelationships between material cultures, paratheatrical display and theatre design in the construction of national identities. For example, Colleen Bawn and Aaron Pogue costumes for Victorian fancy dress balls point to Dion Boucicault's significant position within visual cultural constructions of Irish national identity. And Deirdre McFeely, of course, has written a book on Boucicault's relationship to Irish identity. Despite Boucicault's reputation for grand spectacle, he also strived for naturalistic detail in the staging of such works as the Colleen Bawn and Aaron Pogue, especially in relation to costumes, which were aligned with the actual sartorial practices within the eras and places represented on stage. The surfacing of costumes derived from these plays at late Victorian fancy dress balls and their conflation with Irish national costume showcases Boucicault's role in producing popular and highly consumable images of Irish identity, had their roots in seemingly genuine aspects of Ireland from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. The fame and commercial success of the Colleen Bawn and Aaron Pogue contributed to the resurfacing of red cloaks as part of paratheatrical costuming practices long after they went out of fashion in the mid-19th century, and to the status of the red cloak as an iconic signifier of Irish identity. Red cloaks became fashionable again in the mid-20th century through the work of internationally successful Irish fashion designer Sybil Connolly. Okay, so the next slide, please, Sarah. So Rachel Hand's advocacy for the interdisciplinary scope of costume seems applicable here. She argues that costume transcends any one disciplinary remit, such as theatre or fashion, and that costume embraces the popular and the artistic, the social and the personal, leading to a renewed assessment for how bodies, materials, and appearances are performed through the act of costuming. So can I have the next slide, Sarah? So there's scope then, I'm finishing up now, there's scope for much further work on the interrelations of scenography and nation across a range of European countries, drawing, for example, on the PQ archive and other archives. And I've really only scratched the surface here. But hopefully some of what I've discussed reveals the importance of ongoing historiography, which allows us to see developments as contingent rather than definitive, transformative, or revolutionary, and to include perspectives and connections previously and possibly unfairly neglected. Like nations themselves as imagined communities, imagined scenography, as Prahadova points out, are the result of a continuous, infinite reconstruction process that also works backwards. Imagining a particular theatre culture helps us through the mechanisms of differentiation to create or recreate the notion of our respective cultures and scenography. As such, in order to offer more detailed consideration of scenography and nation, it is necessary to examine both the contemporary, multiply mediatized events of our increasingly digital times, and also their genealogies that might be accessible through increasingly digitized European archives. Oh, and I'll leave you, there's a quote on the final slide, which is from the PQ archive that I'll leave you. Rory.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, Siobhan. That was great. And again, a virtual applause for all of you, all our three speakers on that panel. I know I speak for all gathered and clap for all gathered here when I say how fascinating they all were. It is, oh, hang on, I might check. Yeah, I'm not on mute, sorry. So again, I'll just ask everyone gathered here to put your thoughts into the chat box. And if I could invite Shane, Kasia also maybe to unmute and put on your videos as well, and we'll take some questions from the audience. But again, also just to react very, very briefly and just how fascinating all three papers respond to this question of the conference itself, of the languages of the stage, not just multilingualism, but scenographic and visual language that Siobhan talked about and Kasia talked about, but also the intermedial, the digital and the projected languages of Shane's papers and Beckett. And I was struck, Shane, how for a play that was written for television, adapted to the stage, you're encountering it on YouTube and online today. So all those media are all interesting and coming into collision with each other. I'm just having a look through the comments here and see if anything is, and now my chat is not really moving at the moment. I'll see one question here straight. I'll take that one and then I'll navigate the chat very quickly. So this is from Marguerite Corporal, just to Siobhan, what a great paper. And Marguerite is wondering what the influence of the illustrated press with its many tableaux of local costumes had, and maybe still has, on theatrical practices in the 19th and 20th centuries. Siobhan, if you might want to.
Yeah.
On that.
So what does Marguerite mean by the illustrated press? I know that Hilary O'Kelly discussed, for example, how, so the Ard and Holt book obviously is like a how-to guide, but there were also published as part of newspapers and journals, kind of like how-to guides on fancy dress. So I suppose that it's probably part of a kind of an entanglement of kind of influences, really, in terms of, the illustrated press, these kinds of fancy dress balls, fashion, costume on stage, all influencing each other, I think. But it's probably something that I could look into in more detail, I think. And if Marguerite has any suggestions, that would be great.
Be great. Okay. Fergal Whelan, a question for Shane, in that Beckett's attitude to granting the resettings of works in other genres seems to have coloured by personal relationships. Clushy, Warlow and Alan Simpson are some examples he gives. Is there a sense that current permissions are coloured by similar ideas, and do successful stagings affect future permissions? Shane, just think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more experience you have, and this is from coming from the perspective of dealing with the Beckett estate, from trying to publish unpublished material, but I think the better they get to know you, and it's probably the same for theatre practitioners, the more likely they are to kind of give you permission for the work you want to do with them. I think like the more successful either your research or your production is, I think the better chance you definitely have of kind of continuing working with them and continuing to be kind of given given a little bit more leverage each time. I think that's kind of my experience, at least, and from what I've kind of anecdotal evidence I kind of have. But I think it's almost quite random to some degree from what I can really register. There seems to be some things are given a lot more lenience than others from my own experience, I think.
Okay, thanks so much, Shane.
I can add to Beckett, there has been quite a few puppetry productions of Beckett in Poland, and you get to see get away with more.
Okay, that's really interesting.
I can send you links if you email me. I send you. Yeah. There was a particular director that specialized in that, in the jawajki, we call them in Polish, which are quite, as far as puppet goes, I guess they can handle quite a bit of realism.
Okay.
Which is an interesting one. But yeah, there was, yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure how it's kind of affected by a different. I know it's kind of heavily regulated in terms of French and English.
It's heavily regulated in Poland as well, because it's the translator who translated all of them, holds the rights, and he sort of sees himself as the Beckett eye. So it's.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Adding to that, JP is posting several times about how Beckett needs a media revolution. Beckett needs to be on TikTok.
That can be an outcome from today. We can get a Beckett TikTok account going, maybe. Actually, if I could selfishly very quickly add a question to Shane as well, as we're on this topic, is just curious yourself in researching that paper, is how many different forms of it did you encounter? You know, is it all recorded productions of stage recordings or stage productions that you've seen, or the television versions, or have you seen it live yourself? And how does your own experience of seeing all those different versions, do they speak to each other, or they contradict each other in some ways?
Yeah, I mean the kind of the one I kind of started off with, I suppose, was the original one, or like as in the BBC one with Sean Phillips. It's not really the original, I suppose, but it's the one he didn't direct it specifically, but he directed how Sean Phillips should perform it. So I'm interested in the musicality of the language as well, and kind of how the performance should be delivered. So I kind of see that as almost like a marker for how he expected performances of it to be done. And then I didn't get to see before the pandemic the one in German Street. I would have really liked to have seen it. And I mean, I was probably very young. In 2006, I was only 12, so I didn't get to see the Gate performance then. I've watched the Liam Neeson version, which is Goyen directed that, and it seemed really. I mean, it's the same. He uses the same technique as with in the Gate version, but I think being there would be much different than kind of trying to watch that on YouTube, because it doesn't really, it doesn't have the same effect, I think. I'd love to see it. I mean, I'd really love to see how it could be staged, and I really do think there's I mean, Beckett himself didn't figure it out. It really did take someone else kind of grappling with it, and I think there does need to be a little bit more lenience given so that kind of other directors can. I mean, Beckett wasn't, you know, he didn't know everything, I guess. You know, he knew a lot, but I mean, I think there needs to be a little bit of artistic lenience given to directors and to dramaturgs, and just not without going kind of crazy. You know, I think a lot could be done with kind of small things, because the Goyen's production was very faithful to some degree by still using a camera. It's basically just doing it live on the stage.
I actually think we do have a recording of the Gambon, Joe, here in the Gate archive, Shane.
Okay, that'd be fantastic.
Get you
I'd
up
love
the
to see
road.
that.
Yeah, we can get you up the road from Limerick to Galway post pandemic. Sarah,
Yeah, no, I'd love that.
Sarah, you were happy to go with the comments, Sarah?
Sure. JP says he agrees with you, Shane. And Marianne has linked a really lovely photograph, an image, sorry, of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Rionnach on the red skirts of the Aran Islands. And she asks a question specifically for Kasia. How do you feel about non-translation as an artist? Is enhanced movement essential? How does this affect the work being created? Does children's theater, which tours as a matter of course, have methodologies that could help with language?
I literally forgot I have to answer. I was thinking, that's a great question. Okay, so I don't think enhanced movement is necessary. I think non-translation is amazing for an artist, because from an artist point of view, from an actor point of view, it's a play. It's, you know, I started making theater because I like playing, and non-translation is about playing and having fun. And for me, the enhanced movement is not essential. What is essential is a very strategic dramaturgy to leave, leave those breadcrumbs for the audience so they can hold on to something. So they can engage in their own way, leaving different points through which they can engage, and that's what I've been always trying to do. With the issue, of course, it's what's funded, how do you pay your bills, and you know whether you can afford to experiment, or do you need to get audiences to sit on the seats and come back. That's the tension. In terms of children theater, I don't know if you're asking about particular children theater because you spelled it with large, or is it general theater for kids? I think there is something this is a really important question, because there is a larger and larger amount of multilingual kids growing as multilingual, bilingual in contemporary Europe, and theater for children, yeah. It's the way, like, I'm watching my son growing as bilingual, and the way he perceives language is very different than I. Even though I like to see myself as bilingual, but I'm not growing, I never grew up as bilingual. And there is a Swedish theater, Yalada, who actually grew up with the Forat. They did performance in their laboratory, and then they formed their own theater that is performing multilingual theater for kids. And when I was speaking to one of their authors, she was explaining that actually the children, whether mono or multilingual experience of language is it's not based on the intelligibility, not based on understanding. It's based on following the sounds and understanding. And in a sense, it's not that the children theater has strategies. It's actually kids themselves, I think, have strategies for the theater to learn from, how you can embrace. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, that you allow the audience to follow the sounds as a dramaturgical tool, or follow something that is not necessarily connected to understanding in terms of cognitive, but is more experiential. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, or am I rambling? I have the answer in my head, and I don't know if I'm articulating it clearly. That makes
Marianne
sense.
says that makes sense, Kasia.
Yeah, and I think Marianne had one follow-up as well, maybe just towards you, Siobhán, is about so the eyes of presenting the authentic, or what is considered authentic, through the eyes of the privileged, maybe scenographically. If you had some thoughts, Siobhán, on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, it goes back to those ethnic villages, doesn't it? And this kind of, you know, the authentic indigenous crafts. And I think that can be kind of mapped onto what was happening on the Abbey stage. It's kind of if we think about like a kind of reimagining of those kind of colonial exhibitions, terrible ones, you know, from Exhibit B, for example, which is kind of revealing, I suppose, or pointing to the yeah, the presenting of the authentic through the eyes of the privileged. And yeah, I mean, it obviously, it's spectacularized or spectacleized in a very problematic way, I think. I don't know if you want to come in, Marianne. It'd be nice to hear your voice.
Yeah. Hi, Siobhán. No, I was just actually typing there as I was listening to you. Like I was typing and listening to Kasia at the same time as typing, finishing off. And so apologies for my terrible grammar. But anyway, I just think it's really interesting that reimagining from the perspective of privilege. So what is remembered then and what is highlighted, I think is so interesting and ties in with a lot of the papers that were happening over the last couple of days as well. You know, the kind of what is the big picture, as Joe Vanek was saying, what is the thing that we're going to pull out of an entire culture of peasantry, or entire, you know, that peasantry is one culture in and of itself is really interesting. You know, because there are many townlands and places in Ireland that, you know, one townland would have viewed themselves very separate to the town next door, and not just in GAA terms, you know. So I just think it's really interesting of what gets visualized or what gets imagined. So
Yeah.
thanks very much for a great paper. It's really stimulating, loads of things popping.
And
are there more? Yeah, sorry, go on, Kasia. I was actually just going to say I really wanted to hear more, if there's time, about your conversation with the Abbey's casting director, but yeah.
We can do that later. I can tell you later. Well, you see the question from Martin about the privileging, suppression and promotion of local dialects in theatre. I don't know if there's a study overall, because I think it's so specific to country. The one that I remember, and if you're interested, I can find that, because I don't remember if it was in English or in Polish, but there was a paper comparing to translation of Marina Carr into Polish and Slovak, and why the Slovak translation worked, because there is a dialect that exists still in Slovak language. So there was a nuance in the language that could be, that they could find equivalents. But Polish stage language is highly standardized, and that's, you know, communism. So the dialects exist somewhere in the peripheries, but they don't exist in theater. Sorry for that somebody fell off the bed at the background, if you can hear something. So that, I think, that was really interesting on that impact and how privileges and suppression, how that then changes how, for example, Marina Carr is read in Polish language, which just didn't work. It just, all that nuance that is there wasn't there, was impossible to recreate in a Slovak translation, which did work. So that's the one example that comes to my mind.
Great. Okay, Martin, there was a lot of great points there. Martin's question. There was a piece in there for you as well, Siobhán. I don't think you've addressed one yet.
Yeah, I'm
just about the pageantry in the early gate. Yeah.
Sorry, what was it about the pageantry?
It was pageantry, and this might just be our last question just before we break for lunch. Yeah, so just also for Siobhán, whether there was any gay tradition of challenging easy nationalist pageantry, in commas, narratives, like in The Old Lady Says No, as an example. But just broadly about maybe challenging nationalist perspectives in the early gate.
I mean, it's like, I think the gate, I mean, obviously the practitioners were heavily involved in Irish pageantry, as Joan Dean has discussed in her book, All Dressed Up. But I think there's kind of a duality there in terms of, I mean, okay, if we go back to the Gaelic League's pageants, for me, that reveals how scenography is absolutely central to the construction of Irish national identity, because they were presented in Irish, but they were such visual displays, and that was a way of communicating with an audience who mostly had English as their first language, while reviving the Irish language. So, you know, that's one way in which scenography becomes absolutely central to the construction of Irish national identity. In terms of the gate, later on, I mean, I think they were, you know, commissioned to create pageants. So, I mean, there was an element of, you know, if you're wanting to do something, you have to think of the pageant of St. Patrick, which Joan Dean discusses. You know, they skated close to the edge sometimes in terms of like how St. Patrick was presented. It got a little bit pagan. You know, there was, I think there was some kind of like orgies, like kind of leaning towards orgies going on in some aspects of that pageant in the 1950s. But they got away with it in other ways, if I remember correctly. I don't know if that answers that.
Fantastic. Well, I think that brings us up to the minute exactly of this scheduled in time. So not just outstanding panelists, but outstanding timekeepers as well, which is always great. Just again to add sincere thanks on behalf of everyone to Kasia, to Shane and Siobhán for an absolutely outstanding panel. Just before we break for lunch, just to plug what's coming in the afternoon at 2 p.m. is a next discussion panel about future research possibilities for the Gay Theatre Research Network and post GTRN as well. And I think, as everyone will have seen from today and from yesterday, you know, still so many more new fantastic research questions still coming up. So I'm sure there'll be lots more fruitful discussions to come there. So again, just to wrap up this session and to thank everyone for their brilliant contributions. We'll see everyone back after lunch at 2 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.